Welcome to the Loyola Family Business Center webinar, Leveraging Your Family Business Board in Times of Crisis. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ann Smart. I'm the director of the Loyola Family Business Center. Before we jump into our great content and before I introduce our esteemed panel of speakers, I just want to remind you that all participants will be on mute today. We really encourage you to use the chat box. Joe and Andrew and Joe will be responding to your questions in real time. So feel free to populate that chat box. The webinar is going to be recorded. So if you or your colleagues are actually missing this right now, we will be sending this out an email recording on Monday. And it will remain live, I think, for 24 hours. So please feel free to download it as soon as possible. The slides and the recording will be distributed, as I said, after the broadcast, and it will also sit on a new site that sits on the Loyola Family Business Center website. So one small reminder during this crisis, what we've done at Loyola is put up a website or a page that is a compendium of the COVID-19 resources that we're bringing together across the Loyola Leadership Hub. That contains things that have been written, recordings like this, and an earlier recording by Andrew on resilience in family businesses, and many other resources as well. So please take advantage of that. We will drop that link also into the email that goes out. But for now, just remember luc.edu/FBC. Thank you again for joining us. It is now my privilege to introduce two brilliant scholars and clinicians in the world of family business. We are joined today by Andrew Keyt, the clinical professor in family business at Loyola University Chicago's Family Business Center. Andrew has been with Loyola for more than a few years, we'll say 20 years or more. He is also a gifted marital and family therapist, and family business consultant with Keyt Consulting. He is joined today with Professor Joe Astrachan, an esteemed professor and professor emeritus from Kennesaw State, and a well-regarded and highly esteemed researcher in the field of family business. Joe and Andrew together, we are very privileged to have them teaching our Governance Institute at Loyola. And we get to have all of their combined knowledge today at our disposal. And so we'd like to welcome them and invite them to start talking about how we should leverage our boards in a family business during this time of crisis. Andrew and Joe.
Great. Thanks, Ann. Thank you. Ryan, if you could forward 2 slides. Ann covered this, so if we go to the next slide. So our agenda for today is really to talk about the role of the board in a family business and how it's different now that we're in the middle of a crisis, and talk about some of the main things that a board should be focusing on in the midst of this crisis, and how you can use your board to leverage these examples. So 1 is setting the frame, 2 is ensuring sufficient and effective processes to execute. The 3rd is monitoring and driving processes, and then we have a few additional thoughts about how you can think about this. We're going to try to share real and practical examples from the boards that we've been working with throughout this crisis, and boards we've worked with over the years as well. So if we go to the next slide, some of you who've been through our classes before have heard us say that the role of a family business in stable times is really to hold management accountable for articulating and achieving a vision and a strategy that's consistent with the values and mission set forth by the family. So obviously, times of crisis are slightly different. So what we're going to talk about today is how does this role of the board shift in the midst of a crisis, and how do we use our board effectively to deal with the very real challenges? Let's face it, this crisis is unlike anything we've ever seen before, in that, there's never been a time where the major economies around the world have been shut down in a period of days and weeks. So we need to be agile and be able to adjust in these situations. So the role of the board needs to be focused on both meeting the immediate needs of the crisis, but what we often lose sight of is how we respond in the short term has long-term implications as well. So, Joe, what would you want to add to that?
Andrew, I think you covered it pretty well. It's one of those 150-year issues. These kind of things happen every 150 years. We don't know what they are. And when they come about, they shock the heck out of societies. And people start talking about new normals and how things will change forever, and, you know, blowing the problem way up out of proportion. And typically we have a psychological shift backwards where, oh, you know what, it wasn't so bad as I first thought. And then they underplay it, which leads to disastrous results afterwards. And then people thinking that there's a huge shift again. And somewhere around 4 years, 5 years from now, people will be hardly remembering it anymore and engaged in activities which raise the specter of threat once again.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think really the board can play an important role at helping management and the family not get just caught up in the immediate day-to-day crisis and understand these waves of what we're going through, because, you know, we're still at the very beginning of this, and our boards can really be helping us not just with the immediate day-to-day challenges right now, but thinking about what happens, you know, with the next wave of this and the next wave with the economy, et cetera. So we go to the next slide, Ryan. So really, let's talk about setting the frame. One of the really important things that the board should be helping management do is define the assumptions under which we're operating so that the people in the organization can plan and execute. So the board can be helping say, what are our expectations? And there are kind of four main elements to that. Duration and extent of this crisis. How long do we think this is going to happen?
If I could just add, you don't want to put the management team in a position where they have to both predict how this crisis is going to play out and plan for it. So somebody else has to come in and help them have that overall frame within which they can plan on the appropriate actions. Mm-hmm. This also necessitates, as we're going to say later, that the board has to be involved on a more frequent basis, because as new information comes along, you may be having to adjust what you've been telling management in terms of the overall frame. Mm-hmm. But if you give them both the requirement that they predict how this is going to go, as well as how to respond to it, you're setting them up for a real bad potential failure.
Right. And I was on the phone with a family this morning, and we were really talking about, so what are the basic assumptions, given the best data that we have right now about how things are going to unfold. So when we say predict, we're not expecting people to have the perfect prediction for how this is going to unfold. What we're saying is the board has to help create an orientation. So one example of that might be our assumption right now, based on the data we have, is that the economy is going to start to really open up in 6 months. And so based on that assumption, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And as Joe was saying, as the new data comes in and things shift, we may change that orientation, but what we want is a common set of assumptions that we're all working off of and planning for so that we can adjust as new data comes up. So, we can lean on our boards to help us think about that. What is the duration and extent? And oh, by the way, because they haven't all been focusing just on the immediate day-to-day of our business, they probably will bring in much broader perspectives from different industries that will give us better data to make assumptions about the duration and extent of this situation. The second piece is really the business model. Does our business model still work? I was on a call with a family that has a lot of restaurants, and This particular family is very dependent on tourism, and obviously tourism is kind of dead. So they're figuring out that their existing business model for their restaurants isn't going to work under the current conditions. So they're shifting to a mentality of serving the local population where their restaurants are. So they're understanding that their business model has to shift, and they can't operate under the same assumptions. So Joe, what have you been seeing in terms of business model and how families are looking at the business model question?
It's really an industry to industry specific deal. So for example, you mentioned one in food. You know, if you're supplying the restaurant industry, you got to start supplying individual consumers and grocery, you know, basic outlet. If you're in retail, you got to stop thinking you can have an open store or an open shop. You got to figure out how to have a pickup point, have other people pick the products so that customers can come and not have to risk anything. There are of course other industries that are getting affected. If you're in some elements of healthcare, you're having increasing demands on you. If you're serving parts of the industry that have shut down, like automotive, you got to shift and find somebody else to sell into. That's not necessarily a long-term business model change, but when we talk about business model, we're talking about business model for the current crisis that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things I've been talking about, and the boards that I've been interacting with have been talking about, is what's the short-term survival plan, and then also thinking about what are the conditions that will be indicators that we're coming out of that, and how are we prepared to shift from the survival plan back to a growth plan or building plan. So actually, a question came in under the chat box, which was, you know, understanding that we have to be careful not to overreact. You know, there's also an increased opportunity for innovation coming out of something like this, and it's an opportunity for small and medium-sized businesses to grow. So, how are you seeing the boards that you're interacting with address those questions of innovation and looking forward?
I'm gonna echo something that one of my favorite speakers, guys entertaining, Scott Galloway, likes to talk about, which is there have been a lot of innovations that have been coming along, and that a bunch of these innovations are getting accelerated in this period of time. For example, internet shopping, internet ordering is getting accelerated. The percentage of internet shopping versus not is going to attain a new level now because of the virus. And there are other versions of this logistics issues that are changing. So those kinds of things are happening.
Remote work was another one. You know, everybody's learning to work remotely, so we're realizing that, you know.
Well, yeah. You and I might have a little difference there, because I kind of feel like there's an innate psychological need at each individual that has, you know, I like to work alone, but there are lots of people who like to work with others. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that you take away the psychological need just because you go through a period like this.
No,
but we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, no, I think it'll be interesting to see. I think what it's showing is that the teams can still work remotely and be collaborative. I totally agree with you on the human need for a sense of connection and the physical presence. There's certain types of work, you know, for instance, the type of work you and I do with families sometimes around emotional issues would be very difficult to replicate in a digital environment. So, so another thing that is really important for the board to help with is, what is our philosophy around our stakeholders and how we're going to deal with our stakeholders. So that is helping the management team, who may be very emotionally connected to the employee team, helping them make the best decisions and set a coherent philosophy, and understand that the decisions that we make in relation to our stakeholders today are not just going to have impact today, but an impact long term in terms of our reputation and our experience with the employees moving forward. So an example from one of the families that I work with is that the family had to lay off 450 people in a period of 48 hours. And what they chose to do from a values-based perspective was they chose to pay everybody for 2 additional weeks to ease the transition into being laid off, and continue to pay the healthcare costs for these folks. And actually they added mental health benefits, which they hadn't previously had in their healthcare program, because their board helped them put together a philosophy for how they were going to approach this. And the family wanted to have the reputation that they really cared for their people and they believed in that. And so they committed to that.
Yeah, I had one where, you know, the payroll protection program allows you to retain 25% and spend it on other things and still have it be forgivable. And there's a whole list of categories. But one of the companies I'm involved with said after we rehire these people back or start paying their salaries again, and they were already paying the benefits, the healthcare benefits, they said we're going to have a minimum amount so that people can have a livable wage, even if PPP doesn't require you to do that. So in the end, they're only going to be able to spend like 10-15% on other expenses, and most of it's going to all the employees, which I thought was great.
Yeah, but there's another family that developed the philosophy that their frontline workers were the ones that were going to be most impacted. So their board helped them, and they developed a strategy so that the upper layers of the company took salary hits, but the people on the front lines did not, because from a philosophy perspective, they wanted an approach that realized that the people who were on the front lines of the company earning the least were probably the ones who were going to be most impacted. So they wanted the differential to be taken by the upper tiers. Right. And I've also seen families that have foregone their own distributions and salaries in some cases to help their people. So this actually relates to a question that came in on the chat, which is, do you see some shareholders leaving their long-term goals due to short-term stresses, you know, being short of cash? So if you think of how are you seeing the families and the boards that you're on deal with that? We started with long-term goals, and now we've got a short-term crisis. How do we deal with that?
Well, for the most part, the boards that I'm on, with the exception maybe 2 of the 8 companies I'm on the boards of, had recovered sufficiently from 2008 and stockpiled a bunch of cash. So they're in good shape. And my hope for them is that they get in such good shape that coming out of it, when values are depressed, if they want to grow, they're able to make acquisitions. For the other ones, we started doing as much as we could to draw on lines of credit and get cash and effectively put on hiatus the longer term goals to ensure survival. Because if you don't survive, your long-term goals are out the window anyway.
Right.
So really, that's a question of how much you need to abandon them in order to survive. But the strong emphasis in the family and the owners and the family members in the business is as soon as we can get back to our long-term goals, we're going to go back there.
And the boards that I'm on, it's been talking about how might our orientation need to change. So our long-term goals are our orientation about where we're going and what we're trying to accomplish. What did we learn through the crisis, and what do we want to, you know, maintain from what we've learned that might adjust our orientation, because obviously we're entering a new norm. We have a family that's on the line that shared that they're paying the people on the front lines more because they're more at risk from a physical perspective. So it was really great. have you seen upper level management take salary deferrals instead of straight pay cuts?
Yes and yes.
Not seen it. I have not seen that,
yeah,
but
for sure I have. And also, you were mentioning that family members forego distributions. We don't call it a deferred, and you can't use the word deferral because that sets off all kinds of ERISA stuff. So we would say a pause, hiatus, intention to repay, not an actual deferral. And in that case, and I'm sure the lawyers on the phone might type in what the actual wording should be that I'm using here. In that case, they've deferred part of their compensation. So, setting a minimum amount in order to live if they don't have a lot of savings, and then saying that in the future the intention is to make that up. And also most of the families employed in the companies I'm on the boards of have taken a work without pay attitude.
Mm-hmm. How many public companies have you seen the board members say that?
I choose not to respond on the grounds that it might incriminate others.
All right. And then the last condition around setting the frame is really the board helping to think about what are the necessary conditions for safety for us to start to move forward into the recovery phase. So what are the conditions in the community, in our plants, in our world around us that will be indicators that we can open up safely, that we can re-engage and focus on recovery. So that may be things like the amount of testing available in our communities. That may be the level of new cases and where the curve is nationally or internationally, depending on the scope of your business. Joe, what are some of the conditions for safety and recovery that the boards you're on have identified?
It's the ones that everybody's heard about, so let's not go too far into depth here, but if you're at all feeling sick or have anybody sick in your household, don't come into work. If you can avoid coming into work and do your job from home, do your job from home. Increase the level of ventilation in the buildings. One that a lot don't do, some are doing temperature testing, and I forgot which government entity said today you're allowed to test for COVID and not violate healthcare rules. One of them did. But also the other one is to use a pulse oximeter, because one of the early indicators that you've got COVID is that your blood oxygenation goes down. And for people who are asymptomatic, it goes down for them as well. You can feel fine at 94, 93% blood oxygenation, but it's an early warning sign for COVID. Mm-hmm. So you can have employees do that as well.
Mm-hmm. So a question that came in on the chat was, do you see management getting hyper-focused on the here and now, and what's the board's role in kind of helping them get broader perspective? Is that something you've seen?
That's a great one, and that goes to something we have later in the presentation, which is, when you're a board member, particularly a family board member, you feel like your role is to be critical. So you're helping management by being critical. And in this case, the last thing you want to do is be critical in terms of helping. What you want to do is say, hey, take the pressure off yourself. We know the here and now is messed up. We know you're not going to run it perfectly, and praise what you can praise and help where you can help, but don't run people down in an environment like this one.
Yeah, it's for some people, the anxiety reaction is to look at what's going on and criticize and move into attack mode. And it's really not productive in the long term. It really, I think one of the things that's really important for a board to do is to, again, help keep the broader picture, help the management team define what's important, because one of the things that I've seen the boards that I've been involved in, management feels like they have to solve every problem in the world, and they can work themselves to the bone trying to make that happen. And the board can help them have perspective. Is like, you don't need to deal with the entire universe. You need to help you deal with these three things. These are the things for the short term we need to focus on. Don't worry about the other stuff. Everything's going to be okay. and we're going to do this together. Because if you're into that attack mode, what you're doing is you're putting people into a stress reaction where that's going to decrease their capacity to really make decisions and think through some of these issues that they have to work through. Ryan, we can go to the next slide, but I'll ask Joe this question in the midst. Have you seen any insurance plans paying out businesses during these times?
To that one and to the next question by the same person, which are both good questions, I have no clue. I haven't seen insurance plans paying out, and I don't know what other programs are available from the SBA. There are programs in states and there are programs at local levels that I am not, of course, aware of in all states in the US or globally. But the biggest one right now is PPP, and the biggest thing you can do if you want to get PPP is don't go with a big bank unless you're a very big company, because they feel like the cost of originating that loan is not covered by the small commission they get from the government for originating that loan. So they're not originating those loans at the same rate. I'm sure they'll be investigated. I'm sure in 9 months to a year, we're going to hear a lot of, fines being levied, but that doesn't help anybody right now. If you want the PPP, you got to go for a smaller bank.
Well, and I think the other thing is also in our presentation here somewhere, but it's really that you should have a team in your business. And if you have multiple business, if you're a holding company and have multiple businesses, you should have one for each of the business units. But you should have a team that's looking for these programs and trying to identify them and figure out which ones are we eligible for and can access. Because as Joe said, each state has a different approach to this. We've got the federal programs, but each state and some municipalities also have programs. So we need somebody to be helping to monitor those things. So another question before we get into this slide, as a board member, what are encouraging management? What are you encouraging
management to consider from a leadership perspective?
Yeah.
Andrew, what are you encouraging management to consider from a leadership perspective?
Well, part of what I was just talking about, which is don't feel like you have to solve every problem. Focus on what are the most important problems that we need to solve and the most immediate problems. And also, I'm also encouraging them to use the values of the organization as the foundation for making some of those decisions. So especially when we feel stuck in making a decision, go back to your values and say, if we believe in integrity, how would somebody with integrity deal with this issue? And how would we approach it? Any thoughts that you'd add to that?
Yeah, the one that I like to talk about a lot, which is when you get into urgent times, you kind of are required to make decisions without checking in with a lot of people, but you need to check in with people after the fact and go back to them and said, these decisions can be changed, but I needed to make some kind of decision right now, and show people some firm decision making and give people a sense of reassurance that we're not confused around here. So I'd rather you be upset with me for not seeking your input and make a decision, and us go back and repair our relationship and fix my decision after the fact. It has a better psychological effect on our stakeholders to do that.
Yeah. And from a leadership perspective, you also have to be taking care of yourself, because the more depleted you are, the less likely you are to make those kind of thoughtful and communicative responses. So taking care of yourself and your own health and well-being will help you show up better as a leader in those conversations. So the next slide here is really talking about, so the board's helped set the frame. Now we have to make sure as a board, and we can use our board to make sure that we have the sufficient and effective processes to execute on what we need to get done. So ensure that the companies inside the process or inside the company are sufficient for dealing with the crisis, and again, push back on management if you see deficiencies. So one of the boards that I'm on was very slow to start addressing the issue of COVID showing up in the workplace. And so we pressed them to, number one, communicate with employees, develop a clearer plan, look at the guidelines, and communicate more effectively with us as a board by insisting on regular updates. So, it started with, twice a week updates. And once we felt confident that they were addressing things at a better rate, we allowed them to kind of come off of that and communicate every other week and kind of back up from there. So Joe, talk a little bit about the processes you've seen on the boards that you've been working with, and how are you making sure as a board member that the process in the company are sufficient?
It's exactly the way you were describing it, Andrew, which is the frequency of meetings and the in-between phone calls with the CEO and the senior staff to make sure that they're attending to certain issues that I've heard of on other boards or read about in other places, and then monitoring the processes afterwards to ask the question. You put in this process to monitor social distance in the workplace. How's that process working? And sometimes you get the, oh, I don't know. And you okay, we'll go back and take a look and see if the process is working, because if it's working, great. If not, let's fix it. But this is the reason we put it in place, is because it's important.
Right. And I think because management is so focused on the immediate that sometimes they lose focus on the measurement and the sharing information across the organization about what are we learning in terms of how we're dealing with the problem, maybe at different locations or different levels of employees. How are they different? Do we have a regular form of communication with the people across the management team so that that information is being shared? And are we understanding that all the decisions that we're making today also have an impact on our reputation moving forward? It's very easy to get caught up in the crisis and just think about the survival, which is obviously critically important, but we don't want to lose sight of the fact that the decisions we make today will follow us. I mean, just look at Shake Shack and the other big companies that have egg on their face from jumping into the PPP and hurt their brand's reputation in those moments. So, Joe, do you want to make any points on these next two items?
I think we covered the health and safety policies pretty well, and monitoring and adjusting to new federal, state, and local regulations. That's something we've covered as well. You just have to put in place people responsible to make sure it's happening. And there's no shortage of law firms and accounting firms putting out daily information for people to attend to these things.
So, well, health and safety policies, this is obviously a really important piece that the board has to be making sure that all of our existing policies are up to date and in line with CDC regulations, et cetera. And again, as we said, having a group that's monitoring not just the recovery programs that are available, but also new federal, state, and local regulations that might impact our business operations is important. Joe, are you off mute now?
I was off mute the whole time. Can you not hear me?
You looked like you were. No, we couldn't hear what you were saying a little bit ago.
Oh, wow. No, I was completely off mute. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I have no idea what happened.
Next slide. All right. So this is one that is important. We certainly have to monitor and drive progress. And we've referred to this before, but we have to be meeting more regularly in a crisis than we would otherwise. The reality is that you can't deal with all of the challenges that are out there with quarterly board meetings. You can't stay on top of how fast this is moving. So the board needs to have a regular cadence to communicating. And as I said before, once you start, you can start to ease back as you get people up to speed, but the world is changing very quickly and we have to be willing to adapt. And so I think sometimes in what I've seen, and Joe, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, that again, the management team is so focused on execution that they forget that they have this resource there to help them. So how are the management teams you're working with reaching out to you in this changing environment and using the board to help?
Well, according to my family, they're reaching out far too often. So yeah, I mean, people are calling all the time. I just got a call about what to do in cash flow issues from one of the CFOs. And yesterday was an hour-long call about what the next agenda would look like. I mean, I feel like I'm getting bombarded more and more. And part of that is I've encouraged openness in times when people don't have needs, but now they're calling in that chip. They're saying, Joe, you've always told me I could call you whenever, so let me call you. And if they're not, to me, that's a warning sign right now, because if you're so far behind, there's an expression for the pilots out there, you'll know this one. You should always be in front of your plane. You should never be behind your plane. And that means that you know where you're going so that everything is steering in the right direction. But when you get into a crisis, your eyes start to focus inside the plane, you get behind the plane, and it causes you to potentially lose complete control. And the same should be the case here. You want to make sure that people aren't behind the company. If they're behind where it is and how things are going, the board really needs to step in and say, hey, get your eyes outside the organization, delegate more, and make sure we're moving forward in a direction and not making this crisis worse.
Well, another metaphor that you've used that I really like is that, okay, the world's on fire right now, but we have to realize that the flames that we're seeing, this is kind of the ethos of the firefighter, that the flames we're seeing now were actually created a half an hour ago, and we need to get ahead of the fire, so to speak. And the board is really an instrument and mechanism to help us with that. And right. As you said before, encouraging senior leadership, realize that there's an emotional toll that's being taken by this leadership team, and make sure that you're encouraging and not slamming and criticizing for the wrong reasons or criticizing in the wrong way.
One of the things that we have further on in this presentation is what could be characterized as a full stop attitude. And this is something that can be liberating to senior leadership as well, which is if you're going into a situation that is full of uncertainty and you can't predict the future, it's okay to cut deep quickly if you need to, and incur and hire back. And a lot of people are unwilling to do that, particularly family CEOs and non-family CEOs who are worried that if they cut too much, the family's going to look badly upon them, or the board will look badly upon them. And if they don't just get it exactly right, really temper it perfectly, that people are going to say you failed. But in an environment like this, that's an unsafe route to take, because scaling back little by little by little is often too little too late and can really hurt.
Well, that really speaks to number 4 here, is are we closely monitoring and projecting the financial performance here? And to your point, death by 1,000 cuts in, sometimes laying off in slow in waves can actually make it harder for us to survive and or recover. And so this, again, where having a safe environment in the boardroom where we can debate these things, talk about these things, challenge each other on these things, because as we said, families, the research shows that families are slower to lay off in a crisis, and for many good reasons. But the board should be consistently talking and encouraging that dialogue and that candor to make sure that we're doing that for the right reasons and we can afford to do it, right?
Yep.
So encouraging coordination across the organization where maybe management's not thinking about that, and monitoring customer supplier issues and crisis related issues. So a question came in on the chat about that question in particular. And the question is, are you starting to see red flags from suppliers that raise concerns about their ongoing business health and survival? So how are the boards that you're on dealing with monitoring the health of customers, the health of suppliers, et cetera?
Well, the health of customers is a big one. And there are a number of people who are proactively starting to push out paying their bills as a way of conserving cash. But there are others in that mix who are having problems. And it's a bigger burden on the finance team to start making those calls earlier. But I've seen with a few of the boards that I'm on where some of the longer receivables are continuing to get pushed out, and really directing the CFOs to get their teams together, even if it's not the person's job, to make calls to customers and find out what the story is, because you really don't want to go that far out on a limb, especially in a time like this. Even though it doesn't hurt the balance sheet, it hurts your cash position.
But it's really important to look at your supply chain and what's happening in your supply chain, because it has very real impact on your ability to produce in this moment. For instance, one of the families and boards that I work with has a supplier in Mexico that's been shut down. Basically, their plant has been shut down. So right now, management and the board are looking at, okay, how long is our current supply going to last? They've anticipated that their current at the current rate, the inventory will last until the beginning of June. So unless Mexico loosens up the restrictions on manufacturers, we have to have a plan B, because we're not going to have the product we need to sell, right? So we need to be monitoring our supply chains and our customer base to understand what receivables are good, right? In the construction industry, backlog is the moniker for the business that we booked. How much of that backlog is still real? Or will these projects die? Which are the most likely projects to die? And how do we make sure that we're readjusting our numbers so that we have as realistic sense of our financial performance and our potential cash flow as possible to make decisions? Again, accuracy of information is what is most critical in these situations, because if our financials aren't accurate, and if the data that's coming into our business is not on the mark, then we're going to be chasing ghosts. All right, if we could go to the next. Go ahead.
Yeah, there was a question that came in about PPP changing people's behavior and keeping people employed longer than they would otherwise. So what I've been encouraging the boards on the companies to do is to basically find a way of segregating the money that they've used with PPP just for making managerial decisions, and consider those employees effectively cut if they're being paid out of PPP, so that if the 8-week period doesn't get renewed, you'll be able to see how you were behaving and make decisions appropriately. So it's really tricky, but you got to plan for what's going to happen, assuming it doesn't get funded again, and in all likelihood, it'll get funded again. But you still got to be prepared.
But again, then you're getting a more realistic sense of the financial performance of our company, and identifying the financial impact of that PPP loan on your business, so that you know what the real state of your business is if that hadn't showed up, right?
Right. That was my point.
Yeah. Let's see. So question is guidelines about thinking about accounts receivable, and that's going to be one of the toughest areas, again, assessing the health of our different customers. How do we start to think about, and how do boards help management think about what are the guidelines under which to start shipping to somebody again in this situation? It's certainly tricky, and it's certainly not going to be a perfect thing, but how are your boards thinking about that?
Taking a very one-off approach, which is why there's so much calling going on. At least that's what I'm recommending, which is you need to call your customers, find out what the story is, and find out how much you're going to believe that story and what you want to do with it in each individual case. Obviously, you want to start with your biggest customers first, and then move down that list. But in the end, lots of times you're going to have to restrict the amount of credit you're going to continue to extend to such people and start to roll it back. But you may find that situation where somebody says, you know, you're one of 5 suppliers of X, Y, and Z that I'm buying, or one of 5 brands that I'm buying. And I have lost faith in the other ones, so I may need to do more with you, and then you need to negotiate a whole big thing with them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great. We could go to the next slide, please, Ryan. You know, I was just thinking on that topic as well, that, you know, your past behavior and relationship with the customer is probably also an indicator of future performance. And the more you're communicating with them, the better information you're dealing off of. So staying in close contact with the important customers is critical. So we wanted to add some additional thoughts here for you. And the first one is really around biases. So there are a lot of different biases, and we actually talk about this in the Governance Institute. We spent a whole unit on talking about human bias. So Joe, what are the biases that you're seeing management have in this, and how are you seeing the boards help management deal with those biases?
Well, a lot of them have been around how fast do we need to cut back? Do I have a bias towards panicking, or do I have a bias towards being too hopeful? And that changes the way you predict and make your behavior, you know, make your decisions going forward. That's one of the reasons why it's so important for a whole board to get together to develop the frame, because people are so biased in how they're likely going to see the future. And as we know from studies of prisoners of war, Holocaust survivors, and the rest, if you have a bias towards too much hope without being connected to the reality of the situation, you tend to do yourself in much faster. And if you are really connected to the reality of your situation, but have hope that you'll somehow figure out how to make it through, that gives you the best chance of survival. And one of the worst, oddly enough, is you're completely seeing all the negatives, and you're going out on a limb seeing all the negatives, and that leads to a really quick failure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so again, the board, if you've got a group of people thinking about that, you can try to counteract and push against each other's biases, so that no one person's biases are driving the conversation, that we're moving from the overly optimistic or overly pessimistic to a more balanced view of reality. And then the second one here is demanding candor. This is a muscle that you should be exercising at all times at your board level, is creating an environment where we can talk openly and honestly about the reality of what's happening, and not making up stories or distracting from the reality that's in front of us. I like to say that in times of crisis, we're either healing fault lines or expanding the fault lines that exist in our businesses. So we're either, the crisis is a reason to come together and get over the things that have been keeping us apart, or they'll deepen the fault lines that exist. So candor is how we move through that, and candor with empathy and honesty is critical. Any other thoughts on candor you want to add?
I'm also trying to be speaking of candor, Andrew, I'm trying to be cognizant of time here. I don't want to go too far, and I do want to leave room for more questions too. But like you said, being open and honest, and realizing you don't have time to always worry first about emotions, and hopefully can fix emotions later if people get bent out of shape.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you don't want to wallow in emotion, because that can paralyze you.
Right.
So being encouraging and not critical. We talked about full stop thinking a little bit earlier. Anything you want to add there before moving on?
Let's move on.
All right. Next slide. So again, I think what we're talking about here is that communication is so critical in terms of how everybody experiences this crisis. I was on the phone with the CEO this morning, who was basically saying he hadn't communicated with his employees in 10 days. And he was starting to get employees reaching out to him, asking him if he's okay. So that's a problem. That's a problem. You know, regular communication, consistent communication will keep everybody calm and focused, provided that we're providing consistent messages, we're providing a sense of reality with hope, right? You know, as Joe was saying, not overly hopeful and not so pessimistic that we're undercutting ourselves. But we like to say that if you think you're communicating too much, you're probably doing about the right thing, right? You're probably communicating enough. Most people tend to under communicate, especially when they're focusing on the operations, etc. So there's a question on how much can we ask our directors to stick their fingers into managing during the crisis? You know, this is the constant battle for most boards is what's the line between operational and strategic, because the board should be primarily operating at the strategic level in normal times. But obviously in a crisis, the world's different. How are you seeing that boards manage that line between operational and strategic?
For the most part, the boards that I'm on are staying at the strategic level. Now, if somebody calls up and says, what would you do here? That would be another story. And it's strategic to say, you know, hey, your suppliers, probably all their customers are, this is an example of one of the board members on a board I'm on said, you normally would think that your suppliers or customers either way are completely stressed. They're dealing with their own issues. So don't go and check in with them. And probably the opposite is true. So this is like an insight to give somebody, and it's not a direction, but a suggestion. You know, go call the supplier and say, is there anything I can do for you? Because I know we both want to be here for the long term. And this gives us an opportunity to establish a closer relationship. That's kind of a strategic insight that leads to a definable action step. So at that level, the boards are very active, but at the, you know, you should do this or you should do that level, not quite as much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen the only situations where I've seen that happen is where things are absolutely at risk of completely falling apart, and the board member has some specific experience or engagement that can help deal with that immediate crisis with the ship going down.
I would encourage people to think of it like mentoring. You can mentor somebody and hear them and help them think through what they should do. But a mentor doesn't go jumping in and say, this is exactly what you should do. That doesn't help anybody develop. It doesn't teach them anything. And it really violates that boundary between helping and doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, speaking of that, one of the things that I'm talking to the boards that I'm on about is also how do we help our leadership team consolidate the learning they're getting. You know, we're getting probably years worth of business school education in months here with this crisis. So I'm encouraging our management teams to think about how do we consolidate the learning that we're getting here and make sure that we sustain that learning moving forward. What are you seeing on that front with your boards?
I encourage everybody to keep as many notes as they can, because later they can go back to the notes and kind of coalesce the learning from them, what educational lessons they've gotten out of this whole event. But I'm not encouraging people to do a lot of reflection right now, because there's just simply not enough time to do the reflecting.
Mm-hmm. Next slide, please. So within the family, we think it's important that there be communication between the family and the board. So we don't want the management team to feel that they have to be doing all the communicating with the family. That's why we have a family governance system that should be managing that communication process with the family. But again, the board, by providing those frames and emphasizing the common sense of purpose, we can help the family understand what we can control, what we can't control, and be honest about what the impact of this is going to be. If it's going to impact dividends, how is it going to impact dividends, and be as transparent as possible. You don't want to create false hope, because that will undermine the credibility of the board moving forward if you're not being honest and transparent. And I've also found that you also need to listen, right? That a lot of times just listening to the family and their concerns and their anxieties can go a long way to calming people's nerves and avoiding people jumping off the ledge and saying, I need to sell my shares, or you know, something like that. How are you seeing communication in the world of the families that you're working with, Joe?
Well, obviously, like you, I'm encouraging family members to communicate more and have the board be an avenue and an assistant in that communication process. There haven't been more formal meetings, but there's certainly been a lot more informal communication between board members and family members.
Mm-hmm. And again, I think we always talk about this in terms of building trust, is that consistency builds trust. So if we can't predict when we're getting communication or how we're going to get communication, it is less likely to be a trust builder than if we know that every Friday we're going to get an update on the current state of things, and this is what's going to be involved in it, etc. So consistency builds trust. Ryan, let's go to the next slide, please, which I think is our, this is just, again, re-emphasizing the communication piece, which is that we've got mechanisms to communicate with each other. Let's use them. Again, realizing that, you know, the family council and the family meetings aren't for operating the business or making these crisis business decisions. It's about communicating with the family, keeping the family aligned with our orientation and how we're reacting, and that the board's working with the management to set the frame, create the processes, monitor the practice, and communicate regularly.
Perfect.
So I think that's our last slide. If you go to the next slide, Ryan. Yeah.
Yep, that was the last slide.
So we now have some time for questions for those of you who might have questions still lingering out there. But this, of course, our Governance Institute, which Joe and I teach in, is going to kick off October 8th and 9th here in Chicago. So
God willing.
God willing, yes. Let's hope that things are moving. Okay. So there's a question about how do we support younger generations as distributions get rolled back and work to keep cash in the business through interfamily loans. You know, I think this is a great question, and because it's recognizing that the rollback of dividends and distributions is going to have a differential effect across the family. And it's great that you're asking this question, because it's showing that you're thinking about the health and well-being of the family, which will be a good thing in the long term, right? So the question is, how do we help the younger generation who may be more impacted by the rollback of distributions in this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much hit it on the head, which is it's about the family and keeping the family healthy and going forward. But I would say that for the most part, younger gens that I've connected with understand the gravity of the situation, if not better than their parents, at least as well. So it's, at least in my experience, it's been rare to see people going overboard in terms of spending, and a lot of people have been cutting way back. I like the idea of interfamily lending. I like the idea of helping people out directly. And if that's possible, it is the way to go, as our questioner has pointed out.
Right. And I think another thing is that this is another instance where it might be showing a crack in the armor that has existed for a while that we haven't talked about, which is maybe somebody's not managing their personal wealth in the same way. So this is the kind of Warren Buffett, when the tide goes out, you find out who's wearing swim trunks. And so
Don't stand up, Andrew. Don't stand up.
I guarantee you I'm wearing pants today. which is the constant Zoom call question. So, you know, I think, again, having the opportunity as a family to address, and the most important thing here is that we're looking out for each other's well-being and concerned about each other's well-being. And again, just as we were talking about with the board, with management and being encouraging in a crisis, it's probably not a great time to do a lot of blaming and attacking of family members.
Oh yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have right now, Andrew and Joe. I want to just take a moment and on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for your collective wisdom and your time. We are so fortunate to have you guys available, and the fact that you made yourself available on such short notice. Thank you so much for that. For anyone who has more questions or would like to follow up on this, feel free to contact me at asmart@luc.edu. As we mentioned before, we're going to be passing out or sending out this recording and the slides on Monday in an email to all registrants. And then on your screen, you'll see that we have emails for Andrew and Joe, both of whom are always happy to answer your questions and pick up the phone. So
if I can quickly also
stay safe.
Can I also add, I just want to quickly acknowledge our co-authors. Joe and I wrote a white paper with two colleagues of ours who should be credited as well for the thinking that went into this webinar. Dr. Claudia Astrachan, who despite her better judgment
right now,
who despite her better judgment married Joe, and then our colleague Hermit Corman. So I want to acknowledge their work and participation in this as well.
And if you would like a copy of that white paper, please email me and I will forward you a copy. Is that okay, guys?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Also, anybody who has questions about Governance Institute, you liked a little bit of what you've heard from Joe and Andrew and Joe, lots more of that October 8th and 9th. Thank you very much, everybody. Please take care of yourselves, take care of your families, take care of your businesses. We're here to help.